So I'm going to talk about aspirin, which we've heard about several times during the day. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about MSI testing because we've just done some new research on that, and then I'm going to throw an idea open to you at the end, and I just dropped the microphone. This clip doesn't work, by the way. I'll try and find it up there. So these are my disclosures. I'll leave you to read. The main thing is that that we get the aspirin for all our trials from Bayer for free, and I give them lectures in return. I'm also going to tell you about something that we've patented, so I should mention that as well. So just to pick up some of the ideas from the day, Sue was telling you that basically FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis, means losing the APC gene, and that's the sort of common or garden way of getting bowel cancer. So in most of us who get bowel cancer, they've lost both copies of the APC gene. The difference in FAP is you've lost one copy from birth, so as Fiona says, all of your cells have lost one copy. You only have to lose the second copy to get cancer. And still, most surgeons kind of think mostly about that pathway, whereas we are dealing with another pathway, gets to the same end result of getting you to cancer, but losing mismatch repair knocks out a whole bunch of different genes, produces a very different progression towards cancer. And we know that about 1 in 6 of all cancers has this pathway, and half of those will have a mutation gene called BRAF, which isn't Lynch syndrome, so that's a great way of excluding half of them from doing further investigation. So basically Lynch syndrome, the reason that we got into this game in the first place with the aspirin trial was that not only was it good for Lynch syndrome, but it was a model system for the 1 in 6 of all bowel cancers that are caused by this pathway. So if we could prevent cancer in people with Lynch syndrome, then we are going to potentially benefit the rest of the people who would get those more common cancers. I should say that for the one difference between my talk and the last talk, which was obviously wonderful as ever, is that I won't tell as many jokes as Neil, but at least you'll be able to read the writing on my slides. So you've already had 2 lessons in biology, one of which was from Neil, and so just to upstage him, here is an even better demonstration of the mismatch repair system. But I nicked this from my friend who is shown here, Chris Hine, and I organised a meeting in America, and he's a molecular biologist who works on mismatch repair, and he produced this, and he actually gave a talk. This talk, his 15 minutes talk, is now going to be shown to you in 120 seconds. I kind of speeded it up a bit. So basically, MSH2 and MLH1 get together, they make a clamp, and they join wherever there's a spelling mistake, and they clamp all the way down, and then PMS2 and MSH6 arrive and join up with it, and then XO1 comes along and strips off the strand that shouldn't be there, takes that all the way back to the point mutation, and then runs it again. Isn't that clever? Better than yours, anyway. So, and this actually does confuse lots of people, because if you lose both copies of the mismatch repair gene in a cell, it doesn't change the cell itself. What doesn't cause a problem directly, but it means you can't repair spelling mistakes. And so you pick up spelling mistakes randomly around the genes, and you knock out genes. And the ones that particularly get damaged are the ones where you've got a repetitive bit of DNA, like this AT, over and over again. And if you lose one of those ATs when you're copying the DNA, everything drops back 2. But as you heard from Fiona, that changes the reading frame, so they're supposed to be read in sets of 3. So if you take 2 letters out, everything becomes gobbledygook from then on. So it wrecks the gene. So that's what drives the cancer, and it's actually even more complicated because different types of spelling mistake recruit different mismatch repair proteins. But the 4 that you've heard about repeatedly are the ones that we're most interested in. They're the ones that get most involved in the hereditary cancers. So I was involved, because I'm really old, back at the start of this process, back in the 1980s when we were hunting for these genes. And the first one we were hunting for was the APC gene that causes familial adenomatous polyposis. And this is the call of a young lad of 23 years of age when we took his colon out. And it was meeting families with FAP that made me realise that people who've got an inherited predisposition to bowel cancer are highly motivated to find ways of preventing it. They've all got the same thing. They're already being checked by the hospital, and so you need fewer of them to do a research project because lots of stuff happens, and therefore statistically it's easier to prove things. And there was a European Union call for funding called a concerted action, so we got some money to start a trial in FAP. We've since called it cancer prevention program because it costs us a fortune to get that logo made. So we had to keep the same name. So we basically carried on calling it CAP ever since. And CAP 1 was looking at FAP, but then just as we launched CAP 1, it was actually Ted's DNA that we sent over to America to the yeast geneticists in Boston, who come up with the idea that maybe all these spelling mistakes that they were spotting in these hereditary bowel cancers were due to mismatch repair problems. And so we sent Ted's DNA. He was a shepherd from Berwick who had 3 colon cancers and 9 skin cancers. And we just mapped his family's gene to chromosome 2 when we heard about the work in Kolodner and Fischl. And so he appeared in the Cell paper in 1993. And of course that immediately made us think, well, if this is a much better group of people to work on because you haven't got thousands of polyps, you've just got cancer, and so it's a much easier study to try. And also they're grown-ups, they're not 14-year-olds. So anybody who's lived with a 14-year-old knows how hard it is to get them to do anything, particularly to take tablets and powder every day. So we started CAP 2 in 1994, but in fact it took us a long time to put it together. So we actually chose aspirin based on my old friend Gabriel Kuhn, who still lives in Melbourne. And he did a study, and this is the only Ryan-esque slide that is illegible from 2 rows back. But basically, it doesn't matter that you can't read the names. The top line is Gabriel Kuhn's talk, paper. And basically, anything to the left of the line says that it's better. Anything to the right of the line says it's worse. And you can see all of those studies, beginning with the one in 1988, all of the studies are to the left. It all says that people who regularly take aspirin-like drugs get less bowel cancer. The one outlier was the Paganini Hill study, which was done in very old Californian people. And I used to, remember the X-Files, I used to say they came from a different planet. But actually, probably it's because they were very old. I'll come back to that at the end. So we knew from these studies that people who took a lot of aspirin seemed to get less cancer, but people thought, well, that might be just because you're picking them up better because they bleed, or there's some other sort of side issue. So we decided to test aspirin in our trial. And we set it up, that's Henry Lynch in the stripy shirt there at the top. We had a little meeting in about 1996 of all the players, and that's J.P. Mecklin from Finland on the left. And all the people who are already involved in this space, we said, let's work out what to do. We decided to do the same things we did with FAP, and we put them in what's called a factorial design. So basically, everybody got randomised to 2 separate treatments. They either got the resistant starch treatment, which is a powder that was probably good for the bowel, we thought, and or aspirin. So the top left box is the ones who got the resistant starch and the aspirin, and the people in the bottom right-hand corner only got placebo on both of those. So you could actually do 2 experiments at the same time. You could test aspirin against placebo and starch against placebo, and it gives you 2 for the price of 1. So that was basically the design of CAP 2, and we ended up, I kind of naively thought that by the time we got this going in 1998, that by then everybody would be doing the testing, but it really hadn't started to spread very far. So we ended up travelling around the world to recruit everybody who was looking for people with Lynch syndrome, and we ended up with 43 centres in 16 countries. The most remote one is a place called Namaqualand, and this lady here in the picture, she lives 700 kilometres north of Cape Town. It's a long drive to deliver the starch and aspirin. That's her getting her treatment pack. You'll also see that in fact there's a circle over North America, because Henry Lynch and I went twice to the NCI to get funding, and they wouldn't give us any money to do it in America. It's also listed as Sao Paulo, just because they tried really, really hard. They had it all set and ready to go, and we sent them the aspirin and powder packs, and it got stopped in the customs, and for some reason they were suspicious of this box full of little packets of white powder. So we never actually got any patients on the trial. They impounded it. Anyway, so we end up with an average age of 45, and we treat it for an average of 29 months. Now, the next slide, I'm just going to, for those of you who don't know what all these graphs and they normally look at graphs, I'm going to show you cumulative incidence graphs quite regularly. So on the left, you'll either see sort of 0.5 or 50%. So this is what proportion of the people are affected. So 50% or 0.5 means half the people had it and half didn't. And then along the bottom is time, either in months or years. So here, for example, you've got, in this group of people, if you follow them for 20 years, about half of them get cancer. So you're just counting up the cancers that have happened over that space of time. But because you're following people a long time, you lose them as you go along. So your estimate gets more shaky as you get towards the end. And of course, if you start them over a long period of time, not all of them have been in for 20 years. So the number you're looking at is getting smaller as you get further along the line. So it gets noisier. And so you end up with this effect that you get kind of more wobble, that's less predictable as you get towards the end. So this is the paper that we published in 2011, and I've talked to many of you about this many times. So you can see that basically at about 3 or 4 years out, the two lines started to separate. The blue boxes refer to the period over which we were giving aspirin. Everybody got it for 2 years, then those who were willing stayed in for another 2 years to get a sort of stronger numbers. And the red line is the people who were taking aspirin, the black line is the people who were in the placebo. And of course they didn't know what they were getting, they were just getting 2 tablets and a packet of powder. And the powdered arm didn't work either way, so we got much the same effect from resistant starch and digestible starch. But there was clearly a separation. And statistically this looked to be significant, so the hazard ratio was 0.41. What that means is that there were 60% fewer cancers in the aspirin limb than in the placebo limb. That jump at the end is why I was explaining that last graph, so it gets really noisy. There's only a couple of people out at 10 or 11 years, and so the numbers were completely unreliable at that late stage. But clearly there was a separation. And when you looked at all Lynch cancers, this is per protocol, and so this is basically the people who took the tablets, by the way, so the ones who actually took at least 1,400 tablets. And this is for all Lynch syndrome cancers, and again you see the same effect and the same sort of significance of about 60% reduction statistically in the number of cancers. Now the next slide I'm going to show you, can you put your hand over the lens, because I can't show this on the recording, so you have to cover up.
I can only see you.
Oh, you can only see me? Great! Just keep looking this way. Okay, because I'm about to show you the stuff we haven't still published. So we basically published that, which was to say that 2 aspirins a day for 2 years reduced the Lynch syndrome cancers at 5 years by over 50%. This is the paper we haven't yet published, partly because we've been waiting to do some very long-term analysis with Fiona and Public Health England. But basically you can see that the cumulative effect there has lasted, so the hazard ratio is about 0.58, so it's about 40% fewer cancers in the red line compared to the black line. So in other words, we weren't just slowing down the cancers, they were really prevented. So this is at 10 years, everybody followed for a whole 10 years. We now got some data from Public Health England on follow-up to 20 years, and we've just got the data from Finland on their follow-up to 20 years, so we're actually looking at that now. But certainly the data from England was very impressively separate still, so it looks to be a long-lasting effect. So there's only been 2 randomised trials with cancer as an endpoint of aspirin. Ours was one of them, and the other one was the Women's Health Study. And they had just under 40,000 women, and they gave them a low-dose aspirin every other day and a dose of vitamin E every other day, sort of alternating. And what they found in 2005 when they published their paper was that there was no difference between the 2 groups in terms of cancer. So the aspirin didn't seem to have any effect on cancer risk in those 40,000 women. Now these are not Lynch syndrome patients, these are just generally the general population. And because of our data and also Peter Rothwell's data, I'll come back to later, where he went back to the old aspirin trials, which were done for heart attacks and strokes, and looked up the people who'd taken part to see what had happened to them after the trials, and they found the people who were taking the aspirin in those trials had less cancers. But in fact, in the Women's Health Study, the effect was more modest. There was no effect on most cancers, but the bottom left-hand corner is bowel cancer. And you can see that at 10 years, which is when the trial stopped, the 2 lines separated. And so basically the people who were in the placebo group carried on upwards, in fact slightly accelerated, which I'll come back to at the end, whereas the aspirin group fell away. So in the second decade, there was a difference between the 2 groups. So this suggests then that a little bit of aspirin, a very tiny amount of aspirin, is having a beneficial effect. Maybe not quite as big an effect as in Lynch, but of course these are 2 separate populations. So it raises the question, do you really need to give 2 aspirins, or could you get the same benefit from a smaller dose? The other thing that points towards maybe a smaller dose being effective is a study that was published in 2015. Now this is the Cancer Family Study Group, and basically this is the Colon Cancer Registry is an American plan with Australia, where they just follow people with bowel cancer and they test them genetically, and they had 1,858 people in the colon cancer family registry who turned out to have Lynch syndrome. And they asked them when they recruited them whether they took aspirin or whether they took ibuprofen. Now, of course, this is not as good as randomised trial data. This is just what people did to themselves. So people who take supplements and tablets tend to be more likely to go jogging or cycling or whatever, have a better diet. So they're not comparable. But nevertheless, it was impressive that the people who said they were taking aspirin or ibuprofen for more than 5 years had a hazard ratio of only 0.25. So they were 75% less likely to have cancer in that population. So that was a very impressive effect. And that was most of those would have been taking low-dose aspirin. So the upshot of that was we didn't know whether, in fact, we would get the same benefit if we'd given a 75 milligram aspirin rather than the 600 milligram aspirin that we did in CAP 2. So we needed to do a study. That's because aspirin has side effects, and we heard from Tristan that we all have a risk appetite. How much risk are we willing to take in order to gain the benefit? Clearly in Lynch syndrome we're seeing a significant benefit from aspirin, but taking aspirin for a long time causes side effects. And it scares doctors particularly because most of the people we see in our hospitals are older people in their 70s, 80s and 90s. And so we have a lot of people coming into hospital who are taking aspirin for a long time who have bleeds, and often life-threatening bleeds from ulcers. And so doctors are always very nervous about giving out aspirin because of that. So this is a paper that was published by my colleagues Jack Kuzik and Rangesh Thorat, where they looked at the risks, the bleeding harms of aspirin. And what they found was, in fact, it rises exponentially, in other words, really steeply, once you get into old age. People keep saying, what's old age? Well, I don't think I'm old quite yet-ish, but I'm on the edge. So basically, at my age group, in the 60s, the risk of a serious side effect is about 1 in 10,000. But by the time you get into your 80s, it's up to about 1 in 1,000. Now that doesn't sound a lot still, so that's still 99.9% of people don't have a life-threatening bleed. But when you start to treat millions of people, that's an awful lot of people turning up at the hospital with major side effects. So it seems like something's happening in old age, and we're just starting a new research program to try and better understand that. But what it's telling us is maybe don't use the aspirin when you get into your 80s, get off the aspirin, because of course if you've been taking it earlier, then you'll see a carry out as we saw in that study. So the effects last for a long time, and we can maybe reduce those side effects. The other thing to say is that it's very hard to do research on something that's very rare. But basically the thing that scares people most about aspirin is if you pop a blood vessel in your head and it starts to bleed, if you're on aspirin, then it's going to keep on bleeding. It doesn't clot off so quick, so you get a worse side effect. And there was a trial done in the 1990s called the Hypertension Optimal Treatment Trial, or HOT trial, where they had a whole 18,000 people, and they were also randomised to aspirin. They're actually doing a trial of their blood pressure treatment, but they did aspirin as well. And what they found in that study was that the people who had a normal blood pressure were just as likely to have a bleed in their head as the people who are on the placebo tablet. In other words, if your blood pressure's okay, aspirin wasn't causing a problem. Now, the numbers are still not big enough to prove that definitively, but the logic is the people who pop blood vessels in their head are mostly have high blood pressure. So if you keep your blood pressure under control, the side effects tend to go away. The other thing we've known for a long time is that a lot of people have a gut infection with an infection called H. pylori, or Helicobacter pylori. This is a fairly harmless bacteria that lives in our stomach, but it causes local inflammation. Now, if you've got chronic inflammation, it drives the risk of cancer. H. pylori raises the risk of gastric cancer and Lynch syndrome. So if you have H. pylori, it should be treated and eradicated. It's treated with antibiotics. So regardless of aspirin, anybody with Lynch syndrome should get rid of their H. pylori if they can, because it's a risk-causing infection. But also, it greatly increases the risk of having ulcers if you take aspirin, because you've already got a chronically inflamed stomach. You add aspirin in on top of that, then ulcers are more common and bleeds are more common. So basically, what that adds up to is that we minimise the risk and maximise the benefit by making sure that your blood pressure is controlled, check for H. pylori and treat if necessary, reduce the treatment in older people when people have become frail, but also use the smallest dose that works. And the question is, what's the smallest dose that works? we deliberately used 600 milligrams to make sure we used enough to see an effect. But the question is, did we get a bigger effect because we used a bigger dose, or just because people in Lynch syndrome are more responsive? We still don't know for sure. So we decided about 10 years ago and longer, 2005 in fact, that we needed to do another trial. We always knew we'd have to do a second trial. If one of the treatments worked, we'd then have to do a dose non-inferiority study. In other words, how much aspirin do you need to take? The problem is the world got harder. So this slide was made by Jill, and she finds it funny for some reason. So this is what I looked like when we started CAP 2. And, you know, time takes its toll. I used to be handsome like Neil. I'm still taller. So basically it got harder. Trials aren't so easy anymore. You can't just wander around the world with a briefcase full of aspirin and dish it out. You know, there's all these regulations. And so basically getting past all of these different barriers, particularly, and this is not a political comment, but the European Clinical Trials Directive completely shafted us, because it said you had to have single sponsors, and we had each centre set up separately in CAP 2, and so that meant our hospital was liable for anything that went wrong anywhere in the world, and we couldn't take that on. They've changed that rule now, but it really held us back. The other problem was we had to go through European tendering. So we got free aspirin from Bayer, but we had to tender for the packaging company to put it in packets. And so our free aspirin cost £1.2 million to put in packets. And worse than that, it was all rigidly time limited. So once the aspirin gets past 5 years, or in fact 4 years for some of the stuff in the packets, we have to throw them all away. And we've just heard that the packets that have gone out of date, the packaging company is going to charge us £25,000 to destroy them. Well, we raised another pile of cash to make some more, so it's a bit frustrating. Anyway, so we tried without, and I used to there's an expletive missing out of that actually. I used to say that all the time, but I've given up now. Anyway, so we launched CAP 3, we recruited, thanks to the National Institute of Health Research, we had nursing support in all the teams around the UK, and basically, how many of you were in CAP 3? Hooray! Thank you, we love you. So you all know those packets are driving up the wall, I know, but it just, you know, that's how it was. So basically, I should say, that's what the packets look like for those of you who weren't in CAP 3, and I know they were a nuisance, but that was imposed upon us by the regulatory regime. So basically, you take 3 tablets a day, and you would get either 2 live and 1 dummy, or 1 live and 2 dummy, etc. So that gave us the 3 doses. And this is Nick, who is a furniture maker in Newcastle and just made me a fantastic bookshelf. And he is our first recruit. He will reach his 5-year mark in October. He started in 2014. So we basically slightly juggled the design. Because it was so expensive to package aspirin for randomised trials, we put everybody on the randomised blinded dose for 2 years, and then when everybody gets to 2 years, we ask them to carry on the dose they're on for another 3 years on what we call open label. So we basically just get prescribed aspirin, but you know what dose you're on from that point. The reason we were able to do that is because we're linked into the cancer registry, so we're using cancer as an endpoint. So it's called a hard endpoint. So just because you know what dose you're on, you're not going to keep secret whether you had cancer or not. So it doesn't matter that you know what dose you're on. The reason we needed to have a blinded section is because people are more likely to report side effects if they're on a higher dose. You know, they think, oh, I think I'm feeling more upset. When we did CAP 2, there was actually no significant difference between the side effects in the people taking the dummy tablets and the people taking the aspirin. You know, so in fact, a lot of the side effects people were reporting were actually not caused by the aspirin. So we'll be analysing the side effects, but certainly there aren't any dramatic reports from the Data Monitoring Committee so far. And so the big news is that last weekend was the final day. We finished recruiting. I wanted to finish on the 29th of March, but actually it wasn't allowed. So it was the 31st of March. In fact, I've put the number 1879 there. It should be 1877 still, but there's 2 in the pipeline that will be coming in this week, I think, from Manchester. We didn't just recruit in England, we needed to get to 1,500 to have what's called enough statistical power to be sure of answering the question. So our 26 sites in the UK managed to get past the 1,500 line. But we also went back to our friends in Finland, and JP and Kirsi Pulvinainen recruited 77. Kirsty's name, she's called Pulvinainen, and it's very hard to say. So she always used to be called Pile of Ironing in our office. So Kirsty and JP have carried on recruiting along with Tony Sepala, and they got 77. Spain got 43. Angel Alonso, Nadia Arbour in Israel. All these people had to set up the entire study themselves in order to get to enrol, and Finn McRae and Zaffi have recruited 138 along with colleagues in Australia. So we've now got a pretty good total. The graph looks like this. It's been a long haul. That's 5 years' work to get to the top of that line. But the important message, and I was told by Jill I had to say, there is a Churchillian moment here. This is the end of the beginning. Just recruiting everybody isn't enough. We've now got to get all the way through. So all of those, I know how much of a hassle it is to take the tablets and be pestered by us, but please keep going if you can, because the key issue here is what will be the outcome at the end of the 5 years of treatment. And we all wait with bated breath. We'll actually know the answer in 2024, although we'll start to get some information on the side effects and so on sooner than that. So that's basically the aspirin story as it currently sits in terms of Lynch syndrome, but I've got some new stuff come along that I want to tell you about. First of all, this is the uncommonly handsome Tony Sepala from Finland. He's a surgeon who works with us on the prospective Lynch syndrome database you heard about from Ian. And we've just got a paper out, Paul Muller is the sort of architect of this from Norway, where we've known for a long time that the people who get scoped in different countries, even though the intervals are different, we see the same sort of rate of cancer. So the first thing that's telling us is that colonoscopy doesn't stop you getting colon cancer. It finds them soon enough to cure them, but it doesn't actually prevent them by taking out the polyps. Because back to that, remember that earlier slide, it's not like APC, you don't get lots of polyps that turn into cancer. In some cases you just get cancer, it just arrives. So we're very interested in the mechanism of that, and I haven't got time to talk about it in detail, but the important thing was, this shows that 41% of men being followed up in Finland had got cancer by the age of 70, whereas 58% of the men in the other countries that were doing more frequent colonoscopy got colon cancer, which is kind of upside down. You'd think doing more colonoscopies would prevent you getting cancer, but it doesn't. In fact, it finds cancers that maybe go away on their own. So this is the paper, and this is a Ryan-esque illegible slide again, but the important thing here is that the blue bits, right? So the top line there is the different types of cancer in the different countries doing different rates of screening. So on the left-hand side is the people doing 1 yearly screening, and on the right-hand side, the people doing 3 yearly screening. Now, if you look across there, you can see that there's progressively less blue as you come from left to right. You see that? But there's slightly more green. Now, those are the stages of the cancer. So this is 100% of all the cancers. So basically what that's saying is that as you do more frequent colonoscopy, you pick up the cancers a bit earlier. So the ones that you're picking up on the annual screening are still at stage 1, whereas if you wait to 3 years, you get more of them at stage 2. But you remember Sue told you about the different stages before. The important thing is the bottom bit, the yellowy bit and the red bit, that's the advanced cancers. That's the ones that are invading or metastasizing, were no more frequent in the people having 3 yearly colonoscopies. So in other words, what this is telling us, we think, is that basically more frequent colonoscopies doesn't downstage the cancers. They look much the same after two or 3 years as they did after 1 year. And it also tells us that probably that story that keeps cropping up, our immune system's playing in here. So essentially the immune system is holding and in some cases destroying cancers. And so in doing more and more frequent colonoscopy doesn't do you a lot of good, because the body can kind of hold them. They don't metastasize easily. I haven't got time to tell you about the detail of that. But basically the immune system's particularly good at taking out the cells that try and leave home. So although the cancers grow in the bowel, they're much, much less likely to spread to other parts of the body. So what that's telling us is that the tendency to do more frequent colonoscopy is probably not using our resources as well as we should. And you heard from Tristan before, we can only spend £1 once. So if we're doing more and more and more frequent colonoscopies, that's reducing the availability of colonoscopy for other people. So we're going to hold at 2 years. We're not going to go to 3 years, because obviously if you're on a 2-yearly NHS appointment, it might end up being 3 years by the time you actually get there. So 2 years is still the line to hold. But this is telling us that there's still a lot to learn about the sort of natural history of this condition. The other thing is we still don't know how the aspirin actually works. And so we've just put in a bid for to Cancer Research UK. It's led by Queen Mary's and Jack Cusick, and we're leading a team in Newcastle. We've got the team in Boston are also working on it, and who's the other group? UCL, that's right, yeah. So that UCL are running the Aspirin trial, Ruth Langley, who is looking to see whether aspirin added to the treatment of existing cancers will make a difference. So we've been given a pile of cash to employ some staff, and you've heard about one of them, Richard Gallen, earlier on, who's our postdoc, to try and find the reason why aspirin works. So one of the things we know from the team in Boston is when you look at the cancers, this is looking at cancers according to a mutation called PIK3CA, which basically upregulates the inflammatory type of response. And what they found in their study was that the tumours that had a mutation in that gene that made it more inflamed, if you like, were the ones that seemed to respond to the aspirin. So that's reinforcing this idea that it's not just about aspirin, it's about anti-inflammatories, that maybe the inflammatory response is what we're suppressing with the aspirin. If that's the case, then a bigger dose of aspirin is probably a good idea, because you need more to get an anti-inflammatory effect, which is why we use it for painkilling. The other indirect evidence suggests that inflammation is playing a part here is the study that we published about 4 years ago, looking at the body mass index of people in CAP2. And what we found, and this is a secondary analysis, so it's slightly less reliable, but what we found was that the relative risk of developing another cancer was 2.4 times higher than the people in the overweight people compared to the people of normal weight. In other words, being obese makes you more likely to get cancer. We know that in the general population, it works in spades in people with Lynch syndrome. So it's about a 7% increase per each unit of BMI. What was interesting was that that effect was seen in the placebo arm. It was apparent slightly, but not as obvious, in the aspirin arm. So that's kind of suggesting that maybe carrying more weight causes more inflammation, causes more cancer, but maybe that the aspirin turns that back and suppresses it. That makes sense? But on the other end of the scale, we published this paper 20 years ago, pointing out that salicylate, which is what aspirin's made from, it's mainly made by willow trees, or willow bark. The Reverend Edward Stone of Chittering Norton in 1763 noticed that if you chew willow bark, it's bitter. Never quite understand why he decided to eat a tree. Never explained that. But anyway, basically he published the first trial of using willow bark. But it's not just willow bark. In fact, all green plants make salicylate because it helps them to kill bad cells. Now, that's how they defend themselves against infection. So plants can't cough and they can't run, so they just use the scorched earth policy. If they've got something wrong with them, they kill a bit round it so that it doesn't spread to the rest of the plant. That's called apoptosis, that word you heard earlier on, programmed cell death. So salicylate facilitates programmed cell death. So maybe that's also how it might be working on cancer. It's helping the body get rid of cells that are behaving badly. The bottom line there is that because we grow all our plants in greenhouses now, they don't have any salicylate anymore. So salicylate has disappeared from the Western diet. And so a little bit of aspirin might be putting back something that when we used to wander around in the forest and eat whatever, because when I was a kid, you used to get cabbage with black spots on it, and your mum said, just eat it, it's all right, it won't hurt you. And you know, even a caterpillar, said, well, it's just full of cabbage, just eat it. You know. So basically, we used to eat a lot more salicylate-rich food. We don't anymore. Everybody kind of, chucks it in the bin if it's even slightly dodgy. So then, in the last year or so, a whole bunch of other trials have come out, which are a bit scary, because a couple of them have said things we weren't expecting. So I'm just going to summarise what they show. The most important of these is the Aspirin trial, where they started giving people over 70 aspirin for the first time. And what they found was that there was a slight increase in the cancer rate in those people who were over 70. And in fact, remember I showed you that graph earlier about the Women's Health Study, where after the end of the study, the placebo group sort of went up. And we think what might have happened there was they were all again in their 60s and 70s by the end of the trial. They started taking aspirin. The placebo group started aspirin for the first time when they were quite old. And so if you're starting aspirin for the first time, and you're 70 years old, you might have, in the general population, you might have a little cancer sitting somewhere. It hasn't shown itself yet, but it's already reached the point where the immune system can't quite stop it. The only thing holding it is the inflammatory response. The sort of men with sticks at the door trying to sort of get in and failing. So you put the aspirin in, you take away the men with sticks, you take away the inflammatory response. The cancer says, hey, I'm out and running. So it actually spreads faster. So what that meant was, for the first year or two after starting the aspirin, the cancer rate jumps up. Almost certainly, when we follow that study out for another 5 years, the cancer rate will start to then come down. So you see prevention following that initial little surge. There's also another bunch of stuff that's come out. It turns out in the heart attack prevention, we went too low with 75 milligrams. It works for people under 70 kilograms of weight. So in other words, sort of anybody my weight needs more than 75 milligrams of baby aspirin to get the benefits. You really need a bit more than that. So this is a paper that came out last year, so you can't really see these numbers very well. But basically on the left-hand side, the protective effect with 75 milligrams to 100 milligrams works for the 60 to 70 kilogram body weight on the left. Whereas on the right, with a bigger dose, you're seeing an effect on the people in the 70 to 80 kilogram group. So this is just putting together data from all over the world to try and work this out. So basically you've got a bigger impact of a bigger dose. Big people need a bit more aspirin to get the benefits. And that's only in cardiovascular, but the chances are it might also be true in cancer as well. The other thing, just to show you, is some fantastic data from Peter Rothwell. So some of this data he presented in a seminar. It's not published yet, but he has actually shown it in public, so I can show you what he said. So basically, he has now pooled together all of the cancer information from all of the aspirin trials that were ever done, and worked out all the people who were randomised to take aspirin back in the 80s to see whether it stopped them having heart attacks. He looked them up in the cancer registries to see what happened in the following 10 and 20 years. And in some of these, so in 77,000 of them, he actually has follow-up post-trial. So these are people who took part in the trial, all went about their business. The only thing different about this group is either they got the real aspirin or the dummy aspirin back in the 1980s. And what he found was that, first of all, before I show you that, the one thing he also showed from the pooled data was that proximal cancers seem to be particularly likely to respond in those old aspirin trials. So remember that it's the right-sided colon, that's the bit where you get particularly colon cancer and Lynch syndrome. So although we don't know they were Lynch syndrome cancers, the right-sided colon seems to be more responsive than the left. But this is the data from his very long-term follow-up. So this shows a graph of the second decade, and basically the cancer prevention is dramatic in the 10 to 20 years. So just putting up the numbers on that. I'll just go down to the second one because that's the important one there. So this in the ring is the relative risk of bowel cancer in the second decade of people who took aspirin for 5 years. That makes sense? So basically the chance of having bowel cancer in the second decade is 0.62. So it's 40% less. It's just the general population of people who took some aspirin and followed them for 20 years. 10 years out, you see this benefit. So what that's also, just to go back to that mechanism idea, it must be something to do with programmed cell death of cells that are going to become cancer in the future. So you're not killing cancers because they've got cancer then. So you're obviously killing things that will grow up to be cancers in later life. So this is that kind of long hangover effect that I talked about earlier. So this is the summary to this bit. Latest data strengthens case for aspirin working. Cancer prevention programme show that what we're doing works, and the CAP2 demonstrated a protective effect, and that protective effect is holding. CAP3 is testing 100, 300 and 600 in a big group of people, blinded first, then open label, to see whether you get the same benefits and same side effects from those different doses, and we'll have the answer to that in 2024. And you can follow me on Twitter. The risk of aspirin is greatest in older people and also people with high blood pressure or H. pylori. So if you want to take aspirin, and clearly the evidence is now pretty strong that you will benefit if you've got Lynch syndrome, then try and make sure you get your blood pressure checked and get checked for H. pylori. Bigger people need a bit more aspirin. But starting aspirin later in life might help cancers that are already in the system. I don't think that applies. We haven't seen any evidence of that in Lynch syndrome, but it does seem to apply for people in their 70s and 80s who start aspirin for the first time. So there's the side effects of aspirin plus that suggest that in your 70s and 80s it's probably too late to start aspirin. So this is my best guess. Now, the official line is, we don't know what dose to take, and I honestly don't know what the right dose is. That's why we do the trial. But from now on, since you can't join CAP 3 anymore, you have to make a call. If you want to take aspirin, what I would suggest is if you're a small person, like Neil, then 75 milligrams will be sufficient. If you're an average sized person, then probably 2 aspirins a day, 2 75 milligrams. You can buy them in Boots, you know, the little ones, they're easily accessible. If you are a big person, then maybe you should be thinking about a slightly bigger dose, so going for a whole aspirin. At the moment, I don't think there's powerful evidence to go to 2 aspirins, but basically, you know, that's the only data we have. We know 2 aspirins was the sample or the treatment that worked. So so in other words, I think there's pretty good evidence if you've got normal blood pressure, you can tolerate aspirin, you haven't got H. pylori, for taking an aspirin while we wait for the results. So for those of you who are old enough, in fact we named the CAP studies after Andy Capp. And Andy Capp came from Hartlepool. He was a cartoon figure who did lots of bad things. But this is his doctor, and I just thought I'd remind you of this picture. So the best thing you can do is stop smoking, drinking and fried food. And Andy said, what's the second best? And the second best is taking aspirin. Now, have I got 5 more minutes? Okay. So I just want to tell you about the new research that we've been doing. So you've heard a lot about immunohistochemistry and MSI testing, and you've heard Neil being derogatory about MSI testing, because actually it's not that great. The test was developed in 2004, and you probably can't see from the back, but those traces there, the top line is a normal one, and about 3 down is an abnormal one. Basically, the normal one doesn't look very normal. You get what are called stutter peaks, because the amplification of the DNA slips, and so it's very noisy. So it requires an expert scientist to look at these traces to decide whether the wobbly bits are just noise or whether it's a genuine separation. On the left-hand side, immunohistochemistry is very reliable, it works, but as Ian's work has shown, not everybody's as good at it as they should be, and we've got a crisis in histopathology. We haven't got enough histopathologists. So as we start to heap more and more work, and Neil tells them all to do endometrial as well, it's good if we've got a backup test. And so we set off a few years ago with Mike and Mauro, my senior colleagues in our team, and a couple of PhD students, Ganem and Lisa. We decided to see if we could work out an MSI test that would work on the new machines, what's called the next generation sequencing machines, where you can put through large numbers and do them very fast. The reason the existing system doesn't work on those machines is because those machines analyse little fragments, and if you've got a very big repeat, the fragments are not big enough to sort of span one of those repeats, so that they can't actually tell you whether there's slippage or not. So I'm just going to show you, this is just like Neil, just to sort of make me look clever. So there's a whole bunch of science here. So basically what we did was we took repeats that were little repeats between 7 and 12 letters, that's small enough for the new machines to read it. And as you can see, the normal samples at the top have a bigger central peak than the ones at the bottom. But that's not very strong on its own. But then we had another clever idea. Mauro, our bioinformatics expert, pointed out that because the noise will affect both sides, both copies of the gene, if you've got a letter variation between the 2 copies, you can actually identify that. So here's a normal sample, and the stutter is affecting the green and the red equally, whereas on the bottom line is an MSI high one, and all the stutters with the green and not with the red. We're not going to dwell on that. What it suffice to say that it allows us to get rid of some of the noise and just look at the signal. So we can actually rule out some of those differences as just noise, and it means that we've got a much cleaner separation. And we've also brought in a new type of technology called molecular inversion probes, and this basically focuses right onto the bit you're interested in, but importantly it allows you to put an identification tag in so you can track molecule by molecule the test that you're doing, and you can also mix together samples from different patients because they can be separated by the computer afterwards. So basically what we showed in 2 different sets of data, the red ones were MSI high and the blue ones are MS stable, and you can see that a passing horseman can separate them. The left-hand column is where you look at 24 markers, the right-hand column is just using 6 markers, and it works. And the nice thing is, if you're only using 6 markers, especially when you start putting samples through at scale, it actually only costs £8 for the consumables on the machine. But because it doesn't need expert reading, it'll cut the cost. The other thing is we've chucked BRAF in for free, so you get the BRAF result, and in fact we're going to throw in the KRAS ones in as well. So you can actually get a whole panel of information on any old bit of DNA that you can lay your hands on. It works down to 3%, so in fact even just a tiny amount of DNA that's MSI high will show up, and it will pick up as little as 75 molecules, so if you've only got a very small amount of DNA, it will test it. So we're trying to get this into practice now, and one of the things we've just done that I think will help that is we've looked at children who've got a condition called constitutional mismatch repair deficiency. So about 1 in a million kids will inherit a mismatch repair defect from both parents, and that's not a good thing because it causes major problems with their mismatch repair. And there's a lady called Katharina Wimmer in Innsbruck collects those kids together, and you can see that in the middle is the controls, and the top ones, these are ordinary blood samples from these kids. And because they have a few blood cells floating around that are MSI high, we can pick them out of the crowd. So in other words, this is a very sensitive test. It works on a blood sample for this condition, which then brings me to my final question. This is the thought. So last weekend, after I'd done the talk in Boston, I was stuck in a hotel room on my own for a whole day, and I was supposed to be doing work, but I just started daydreaming. And it suddenly struck me that this test might work for urine cancer. So uroepithelial cancers, people get cancers in the kidney and in the pipes running out the kidney. We don't have a test for that yet, but actually if we had some samples of urine from people who had uroepithelial cancer, I bet the MSI test would pick them up. Which raises the broader question for all of you to think about, that maybe we could work together to actually work out how we might collect some samples from people who've got cancer with Lynch syndrome, so we can see if these tests would work. Because potentially we could move towards having a blood test that would pick up cancers wherever they were by looking for MSI high DNA circulating in the bloodstream. And that would obviously be great because it would back up our colonoscopy and endoscopy and all the other tests we do by just looking for cancer wherever it may be. But to do that, we're going to need samples from people with Lynch syndrome who've got cancer, and that's going to be the challenge that we face. So I will stop there and leave you to think about that. These are all the wonderful people whose shoulders I stand on. In particular, that's the team who you will have interaction with from the CAP3 group, led by Jill, who's in the room, and checking everything I say. Thank you for your attention.